September 21st, 1944, Oosterbeek, Holland. Major Robert Cain crouches in a slit trench, temporarily blind, his face blackened and bleeding. Seconds ago, a PIAT bomb exploded in front of him, a faulty round detonating as it left the weapon. Shrapnel peppers his skin. His eardrums have already burst from days of constant explosions. But through the smoke and dust, he can hear the grinding treads of another German tank approaching. Cain cannot see it. He can barely stand. But he is shouting like a hooligan, he will later say, for someone to get onto the PIAT because there is another tank behind. The weapon that soldiers called a load of rubbish. The weapon the British Ordnance Board rejected as ineffective under any conceivable conditions of employment. That weapon had just destroyed 6 German tanks in Major Cain's hands alone, and the battle was not over. This is the story of the ugliest, most hated infantry weapon in the British Army, and how it earned 6 Victoria Crosses. In November 1941, the British 8th Army launched Operation Crusader in North Africa. It was meant to be the knockout blow against Rommel's Afrika Korps. After the battle, staff officers conducted an exhaustive analysis of anti-tank combat during the operation. They were looking for lessons learned, for data on what worked and what failed. What they found was damning. The British infantry's standard anti-tank weapon was the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a 36-pound monster that fired a half-inch tungsten-cored bullet at armored targets. It kicked so hard that soldiers joked it would dislocate your shoulder if you did not brace it properly. Sergeant Edward Doe of the King's Royal Rifle Corps described firing one for the first time in combat. "I fired at a tank coming over a bridge from about 50 yards away. I could not miss, and I saw this hit the tank, and all it had done was just about knock the paintwork off. It made a noise like a ping-pong ball." After Operation Crusader, 8th Army analysts could not find a single documented instance of a Boy's rifle knocking out a German tank. Not one. Across an entire army-level offensive involving hundreds of these weapons, they had achieved precisely nothing against German armor. The British infantry had a problem. German tanks were getting thicker armor with each new model. The Panzer III and Panzer IV that dominated North Africa in 1941 would give way to the Panther and Tiger, behemoths with frontal armor exceeding 100 millimeters. A man with a rifle, even a very large rifle, could not penetrate that kind of steel. The infantrymen needed something revolutionary. The Americans had the bazooka, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher that was light, simple, and effective. The Germans had the Panzerfaust and Panzer Schreck, disposable and reusable rocket launchers respectively. Both systems used rocket propulsion, and both produced a massive backblast of flame when fired. The British, characteristically, went a different way entirely. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker was an inventor with an obsession. He had been developing spigot mortars, weapons that fired projectiles not from a barrel but from a central rod that fit inside a hollow tail. The concept dated back to the First World War, but Blacker believed he could make it work for anti-tank warfare. His early designs were clumsy. The Blacker Bombard, a 20-pound behemoth intended for the Home Guard, required a crew of 4 and had an effective range of barely 100 yards. But Blacker had stumbled onto something important: shaped charge ammunition. A shaped charge does not rely on velocity to penetrate armor. Instead, it uses the geometry of its explosive, a cone of copper surrounded by high explosive, to focus the detonation into a superheated jet capable of burning through steel. It did not matter how fast the projectile was traveling when it hit. What mattered was the design of the warhead. This was perfect for a spigot mortar, which could never achieve the velocities of a conventional gun. Blacker designed a shoulder-fired version and presented it to the War Office in 1941. The verdict was catastrophic. In August 1941, the British Ordnance Board examined Blacker's weapon and issued one of the most memorable rejections in military history. The weapon, they concluded, would prove ineffective as an anti-tank weapon under any conceivable conditions of employment. Under any conceivable conditions, the prototype was shelved, Blacker was shuffled aside, and the British infantrymen remained armed with an anti-tank rifle that bounced off German armor like ping-pong balls. But the weapon found its way to Ministry of Defense 1, the secret weapons development unit known informally as Churchill's Toy Shop. Located at a country house called the Firs in Whitchurch, MD1 operated under the direct protection of the Prime Minister himself. Winston Churchill, as Minister of Defense, shielded the unit from the Ministry of Supply and the Ordnance Board, the same board that had rejected Blacker's weapon. There, Major Millis Jeffreys took Blacker's flawed design and rebuilt it from the ground up. Jeffreys was a Royal Engineer sapper with experience in India, a practical man who understood that weapons needed to work in mud and rain and chaos, not just on test ranges. His deputy, Stuart McCrae, was a former editor of Armchair Science magazine who had been called up for war service and found himself developing unconventional weapons. Between them, Jeffreys and McCrae had already created the sticky bomb, the limpet mine, and a dozen other devices that the conventional military establishment would never have approved. The PIAT was simply another problem to solve. Jeffries strengthened the casing. He improved the spring mechanism. He redesigned the shaped charge warhead using the latest hollow charge technology. He worked with scientists at Imperial Chemical Industries to combine the best elements of Blacker's original concept with practical improvements that would make the weapon reliable under field conditions. Churchill himself took an interest in the project. In January 1943, he wrote to the Secretary of State for War, asking why the name Jeffries shoulder gun was being changed to PIAT. Nobody objected to the boy's rifle, Churchill noted, although that had a rather odd ring. He lost that argument. The weapon became the PIAT, but his support ensured the project would not be killed by bureaucratic interference. And so Major Millis Jeffries created what would become the projector, infantry, anti-tank. The weapon that emerged was, by any aesthetic measure, hideous. 32 pounds of steel tube, spring mechanism, and crude aperture sights. No handles, no sling, no elegant lines, just a brutalist cylinder with a shoulder pad at one end and a loading trough at the other. The men who would carry it into combat would despise its appearance before they ever fired a round. But appearance was the least of the PIAT's problems. To fire the weapon, you first had to cock it, and cocking the PIAT required a procedure that bordered on medieval torture. The soldier would unlatch the shoulder pad, place both feet on it as though mounting a pogo stick, give the weapon a half-turn to unlock the body, then pull the entire tube straight up against a spring with 200 pounds of draw weight. 200 pounds, the equivalent of doing a standing curl with a small adult human. Soldiers of smaller stature simply could not manage it alone. Training manuals acknowledged that 2 men might be required to cock the weapon. The recoil was equally punishing. When the spigot slammed forward to ignite the propellant charge in the bomb's tail, the entire 12-pound assembly shifted violently backward. If the shooter did not brace properly, the automatic recocking mechanism would fail, and he would have to repeat the entire pogo stick procedure under fire. Veterans reported bruised shoulders, broken collarbones, and teeth loosened from the jarring impact. Sergeant Wagger Thornton of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, a man who would use the weapon to change history at Pegasus Bridge, summarized the soldier's view with characteristic bluntness. The PIAT actually is a load of rubbish, really. The range is around about 50 yards and no more. You are a dead loss if you try to go farther. Even 50 yards is stretching it, very much so. Another thing is that you must never miss. If you do, you have had it, because by the time you reload the thing and cock it, which is a bloody chore on its own, everything is gone. You are done. A load of rubbish. That was the weapon British infantrymen would carry into Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Holland, Burma, and every other theatre where the Empire fought. Production began in August 1942. By the time the war ended, over 115,000 PIATs had been manufactured, along with more than 7.5 million bombs. Every infantry battalion received 21 of them, distributed throughout the unit. There were no dedicated PIAT crews. Every infantryman trained with the weapon. When the moment came, the platoon commander simply assigned whoever was available. The PIAT first saw combat in Tunisia in early 1943, and its debut was not promising. The bombs had a tendency to misfire if they struck armor at anything other than a square angle. The fuse would skip off or tear away entirely. Confidence in the weapon plummeted. Soldiers who already hated the cocking mechanism now doubted whether the thing would even work if they hit their target. Engineers scrambled to fix the problem. They redesigned the fuse holder. They switched from an impact fuse to a graze fuse, one triggered by deceleration rather than the crushing of a nose probe. They replaced the original plastic explosive filler with TNT for more reliable detonation. The Mark III bomb, issued in time for the invasion of Sicily, represented a substantial improvement. But the reputation damage had been done. Soldiers remembered the failures. They whispered about unreliability. The PIAT remained unloved. And then came June 6, 1944. In the early hours of D-Day, 6 Horsa gliders descended through the darkness over Normandy. Their target was a small lifting bridge over the Caen Canal, a structure that would become known to history as Pegasus Bridge. Major John Howard commanded the operation. His men had to capture the bridge intact, then hold it against whatever counterattack the Germans could muster until relieved by forces advancing from Sword Beach. The gliders landed with stunning precision, some crashing to a halt within yards of the bridge itself. Within 10 minutes, Howard's men had seized both the canal bridge and a second crossing over the River Orne 500 yards to the east. The German defenders were overwhelmed before they fully understood what was happening. But Howard knew the counterattack would come. German units were stationed in surrounding villages. Armored vehicles were reported in the area. His airborne troops had no anti-tank guns. The gliders could not carry anything that heavy. What they had was a handful of gammon bombs, some grenades, and exactly one functional PIAT. The tanks came around 1:30 in the morning. Private Eric Woods would remember what happened next for the rest of his life. "One of my most vivid memories on reaching the bridge," he recalled, "was finding myself lying alongside Sergeant Thornton, who was armed with an anti-tank weapon. On the road on the opposite side of the bridge was a junction, and from there emerged 3 French tanks which had been commandeered by the Germans. Sergeant Wagger Thornton, the same man who had called the PIAT a load of rubbish, heard the grinding of treads approaching from the T-junction beyond the bridge. The night was dark, the canal water black and still beneath them. Howard's men had no idea how many vehicles were coming. They only knew that they had one functional PIAT, a handful of gammon bombs, and whatever small arms ammunition remained in their pouches. Thornton positioned himself in the darkness with the weapon he despised. The lead vehicle rounded the corner, a half-track, its machine gun already traversing, searching for targets. Behind it, the darker silhouettes of heavier armor. This was not a probe, this was a counterattack. He let it close to 30 yards, close enough to see the outline of the driver, close enough that missing was almost impossible. And missing, as Thornton himself had said, meant you were done. Then he fired. The PIAT bomb struck the half-track broadside, and the result exceeded anything in the training manuals. The shaped charge must have hit the vehicle's ammunition storage because the half-track did not merely stop, it exploded. A pillar of fire erupted into the night sky. Secondary detonations began almost immediately as stored rounds cooked off. The burning wreckage blocked the road completely, and ammunition continued to explode for over an hour, casting flickering orange light across the canal and the bridge the airborne troops had seized. The German column halted. In the darkness, with the lead vehicle transformed into a pillar of fire and secondary explosions still crackling through the night, the following tanks could not determine what had hit them. A 6-pounder anti-tank gun, a hidden artillery piece. They did not know that one sergeant with a weapon he hated had stopped them cold. They withdrew to reassess. That single PIAT shot may have saved the Pegasus Bridge operation. Without anti-tank weapons, Howard's men would have been helpless against armor. The Germans would have retaken the bridges. The eastern flank of the entire D-Day invasion would have been compromised. Instead, the airborne troops held until Lord Lovat's commandos arrived that afternoon, bagpipes playing as they marched across the bridge that Wagger Thornton's PIAT had helped secure. Across Normandy that summer, similar scenes repeated themselves in hedgerows and villages throughout the beachhead. The PIAT could not match the range of a proper anti-tank gun. It could not provide the sustained firepower of a tank destroyer, but it gave individual soldiers, men crouching in ditches and firing from ruined buildings, a fighting chance against German armor. Analysis of the Normandy campaign would later reveal a striking statistic. During the initial period of fighting, 7% of all German tanks destroyed were killed by PIATs. 7%, more than roving Allied fighter-bomber patrols achieved with their rockets and cannon, more than the boys' anti-tank rifle had managed in the entire North African campaign combined. The weapon the Ordnance Board had rejected under any conceivable conditions was proving itself in the most conceivable condition of all, desperate infantry combat against superior armor. But Normandy was only the beginning. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden sent British airborne forces deep into Holland. The plan was audacious: capture a series of bridges leading into Germany and end the war by Christmas. The final bridge was at Arnhem, across the Lower Rhine. It became a bridge too far. German forces in the area were stronger than Allied intelligence had predicted. 2 SS Panzer divisions were refitting near Arnhem when the paratroopers dropped. Within hours, the British found themselves fighting for survival against tanks, self-propelled guns, and overwhelming infantry. Major Robert Cain of the 2nd South Staffordshire Regiment landed on the second day of the operation. Born in Shanghai in 1909 to British parents working abroad, Cain had grown up on the Isle of Man before joining the military. By September 1944, he was 35 years old, ancient by airborne standards, and commanding B Company of a glider-borne infantry battalion. His first attempt to reach Holland had ended in farce. 5 minutes after takeoff from Manston Airfield, his glider's tow rope snapped. The pilots brought the aircraft down safely in an English field, tearing through a hedge before stopping. One of the pilots examined the broken rope and called it diabolical. The same thing had happened to him on D-Day. Cain and his men returned to the airfield and boarded a replacement glider for the second lift on September 18th. They landed near Wolfhays, west of Arnhem, into a situation that was already deteriorating. The battalion was supposed to reinforce the troops at the bridge, but German armor blocked every approach. At the St. Elizabeth Hospital, Cain found himself in a hollow on a slope outside the Municipal Museum. surrounded by what remained of his men, and facing tanks with nothing but PIATs and mortars. The South Staffords had no anti-tank guns. The gliders could not carry them. What they had were shoulder-fired weapons and the desperate courage of men who knew they were trapped. For the next 6 days, Robert Cain became a one-man anti-tank unit. On September 20th, a Tiger tank approached his position. Cain went out alone with a PIAT, took a firing position, and waited until the tank was only 20 yards away. 20 yards, close enough to see the driver's vision slit, close enough to feel the heat from the engine. He fired. The bomb struck. The Tiger stopped, its gun traversing to find him. The tank fired, blowing away the corner of a building where Cain had been lying. Masonry rained down. Cain was wounded by falling debris, but continued firing until the Tiger was disabled. Only then did he allow a 75mm howitzer to be brought up to finish the job. The next morning he drove off 3 more tanks with the same weapon. On September 21st, German armor pushed down the Plögserweg, trying to cut the British perimeter off from the river. Cain grabbed a PIAT and began lobbing bombs over a house at the advancing vehicles, using the weapon in its secondary role as an improvised mortar, with an artillery officer in an upper window spotting for him. Tank fire hit the house. The officer was killed. The chimney collapsed almost on top of Cain, but he kept firing. When another self-propelled gun came down the road, Cain crawled to the corner of his trench and engaged it from 30 yards. His first bomb probably hit the tracks. The vehicle fired back immediately, throwing up a massive cloud of smoke and dust. As soon as Cain could see again, he fired a second bomb. Then his PIAT exploded. Whether from a faulty fuse or a misaligned bomb, the shaped charge detonated just as it left the weapon. The blast threw Cain backward, peppered his face with fragments, and temporarily blinded him. He could not see. His ears were already destroyed from days of explosions. He had been stuffing cotton wool in them and continuing to fight. But even blind and deafened, he kept shouting orders. "I was shouting like a hooligan," he recalled after the war. "I shouted to somebody to get onto the PIAT because there was another tank behind. I blubbered and yelled and used some very colorful language. They dragged me off to the aid post." His eyesight returned within 30 minutes. Cain walked back to the front line. By September 25th, the British perimeter had shrunk to a fraction of its original size. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The last PIAT had been destroyed. Cain was reduced to firing a 2-inch mortar, a weapon designed for smoke screens and illumination rounds, at German tanks in a final desperate defense. Somehow it worked. The Germans withdrew in disorder after 3 hours of fighting. That night, the remnants of the 1st Airborne Division evacuated across the Rhine. Major Cain, like a captain on a sinking ship, waited until every one of his surviving men had crossed before he attempted the river himself. Of the 5 Victoria Crosses awarded for actions at Arnhem, Robert Cain was the only recipient who lived. His citation noted that by the end of the battle, he had personally destroyed or disabled 6 tanks, 4 of them Tigers, along with a number of self-propelled guns. His coolness and courage under incessant fire, the citation concluded, could not be surpassed. Major Richard Lonsdale, commanding the 11th Parachute Battalion during the same battle, wrote in his after-action report that the PIAT proved of immense value. The tragedy of the operation, he continued, was the shortage, and towards the end, the complete lack of them. Time without number, the cry was, "Give me the PIATs, and we will stay until Christmas. Give me the PIATs," from a weapon soldiers called rubbish, from a weapon the Ordnance Board said would fail under any conceivable conditions. The same pattern repeated itself on the other side of the world. On June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, Japanese forces attacked British positions near Ningthohong in the Imphal region of India. The assault was supported by 5 medium tanks. Japanese armor was not as formidable as German panzers, but to an infantryman without anti-tank weapons, any tank was terrifying. Rifleman Ganju Lama of the 7th Gurkha Rifles was the number 1 on his unit's PIAT. He was 19 years old. His real name was Gyamtso Shangdapa, but a clerk at the recruiting office had found it unpronounceable and written down Ganju Lama instead. Ganju because he was bald, Lama because of his Buddhist background. He was not even a Gurkha. He came from the Bhutia community in Sikkim, but the regiment was desperate for manpower and accepted anyone who resembled the legendary Nepalese fighters. A month earlier, on the Tidim Road, Ganju Lama had already proven himself. His unit surprised a Japanese formation and came under fire from tanks mounting 37mm guns. Ganju Lama had crawled forward with his PIAT, positioned himself at 60 yards, and destroyed 2 enemy vehicles. He received the military medal for that action, though it would not be gazetted until after his Victoria Cross. Now, on June 12th, the Japanese were back with more armor and more infantry. When the tanks broke through the perimeter, supported by an hour-long artillery barrage that had knocked out bunkers and caused heavy casualties, Ganju Lama did not wait for orders. He grabbed his PIAT and crawled forward through thick mud toward the enemy armor. The ground was a morass. The monsoon season had turned the earth to sucking clay that grabbed at his elbows and knees as he pulled himself forward. Ahead, 3 Japanese medium tanks were grinding toward the British lines, their machine guns raking the positions where his comrades sheltered. He was hit almost immediately. A bullet shattered his left wrist, the bones splintering, his hand suddenly useless. Another round struck his right hand. A third tore through his leg, adding blood to the mud that coated his body. Bleeding profusely, his bones broken, he kept crawling. He had to get within 30 yards for the PIAT to be effective. The Japanese knew it. Their machine guns concentrated on the lone figure dragging himself through the muck toward their tanks. Geysers of mud erupted around him as bullets churned the earth. He made it. From 30 yards, possibly less, Ganju Lama opened fire. His first bomb destroyed the lead tank. He reloaded with broken hands, the pain unimaginable, and fired again. The second tank exploded. A third was knocked out by an anti-tank gun that had finally gotten into position. But Ganju Lama was not finished. The tank crews were trying to escape. He dropped his PIAT, pulled the pins on grenades with his teeth. He could not use his shattered hands properly, and threw them at the fleeing Japanese. He killed or wounded every crew member before he finally allowed himself to be evacuated. He would carry a Japanese bullet in his leg for 19 years before doctors finally found it during a routine examination. Ganju Lama received the Victoria Cross from the Viceroy of India in Delhi, with Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten and General William Slim in attendance. When he first heard about the award, he did not know what it was. He was a simple, illiterate hillman, he later explained, and had no idea what this Victoria Cross thing meant. He learned soon enough. In Italy, on the night of October 21st through 22nd, 1944, Private Ernest Smith of the Canadian Seaforth Highlanders faced a similar crisis. Born in New Westminster, British Columbia in 1914, Smith had come of age during the Great Depression and struggled to find steady work. He joined the Canadian Army in March 1940 at age 25 and quickly established a reputation as both a fearless soldier and an incorrigible troublemaker. Smith had been promoted to corporal and demoted back to private 9 separate times during his military career. He was, by his own admission, not fond of following orders. But when push came to shove, his own phrase, he was unflinching. He had landed in Sicily in July 1943, fought through the brutal street battles of Ortona that December, and been wounded twice. By October 1944, he was an experienced combat infantryman who happened to hold the rank of private because he could not stop getting into trouble. His unit had crossed the Saviour River to establish a bridgehead, but torrential rain had caused the river to rise 6 feet in 5 hours. The banks were too soft and vertical to bridge. No tanks could cross. No anti-tank guns could be brought forward. When 3 Panther tanks counterattacked at dawn, supported by 2 self-propelled guns and approximately 30 infantry, Smith's company had nothing but PIATs and small arms. Smith saw his PIAT group pinned down by machine gun fire. He did not wait for orders. He took command of the section and led his 2-man team across open ground under fire to find a better position. A ditch on the far side of a road offered some cover and a better angle on the approaching armor. His partner, Private Tennant, a man Smith described as thick as thieves with him, was wounded almost immediately. German infantry on the lead Panther threw grenades. Machine gun fire raked their position. Tennant took shrapnel in the shoulder and arm. Smith did not retreat. He dropped into the ditch, positioned his PIAT, and waited as the Panther closed the distance. Its MG-34 was still firing, still searching for him. The tank was now within 10 meters, 30 feet, close enough that Smith could see the muzzle of the machine gun, close enough that he barely had time to aim. He fired. The Panther continued forward a few yards, then stopped. Severely damaged, it began trying to back away from the Canadian position, but the German infantry, who had been riding on the tank, dismounted and rushed Smith's position. He dropped his PIAT, grabbed a Thompson submachine gun, and killed 4 of them. The rest fell back. A second Panther advanced, firing from beyond PIAT range. Smith held his position, found more ammunition magazines in the ditch, and kept shooting until reinforcements arrived. He then carried his wounded partner to safety before returning to guard the road. By morning, 1 Panther and both self-propelled guns had been destroyed. The bridgehead held. He was the only Canadian private to receive the Victoria Cross in the Second World War. 6 Victoria Crosses in total were awarded for actions involving the PIAT. 6 of the highest decorations for valor in the British Commonwealth, earned with a weapon that weighed 32 pounds, required 200 pounds of force to cock, kicked like a mule, and had an effective range shorter than a cricket pitch. The contrast is almost absurd. The Ordnance Board's rejection letter, ineffective under any conceivable conditions of employment, should be framed and displayed in every museum that houses a PIAT. Because the conditions that proved the weapon's worth were not conceivable to men sitting in comfortable offices evaluating prototype weapons. They were conceivable only to the soldiers who had no other choice. A man in a slit trench cannot call for air support. He cannot request artillery. He cannot wait for a tank destroyer to arrive. He has what he is carrying, and what he is carrying has to work. The PIAT worked, not elegantly, not comfortably, not at ranges that anyone would call safe, but it worked. The weapon had one advantage that no rocket launcher could match: no backblast. The bazooka and Panzerschreck vented massive jets of flame from their rear ends when fired. This made them impossible to use from enclosed spaces. Fire one inside a building, and you would incinerate yourself and anyone behind you. It also produced a signature that enemy observers could spot instantly. The PIAT produced only a small puff of smoke from the propellant charge. You could fire it from a basement window. You could fire it from a doorway. You could fire it from a slit trench without revealing your position. In the close-range fighting that characterized Normandy's hedgerows, Italy's villages, and Holland's urban perimeters, this advantage was decisive. German troops learned to fear the weapon they could not see coming. The PIAT remained in British service until the early 1950s, when it was finally replaced by American rocket launchers. By then, the weapon had seen action in theaters far beyond the Second World War. The Jewish Haganah used PIATs during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, one of their few anti-tank weapons in the desperate fighting for independence. Dutch forces employed them in the Indonesian War of Independence. French troops carried them into Indochina. More than 75 years later, the PIAT remains one of the most unusual infantry weapons ever fielded. It looks like something from a steampunk nightmare, a spring-powered tank killer designed by madmen and carried by men who had every right to hate it. But hatred did not stop them from using it, and using it did not stop them from winning. Think about Major Robert Cain, temporarily blinded by an exploding PIAT bomb, shouting for someone to grab the weapon and keep fighting because there was another tank coming. Think about Rifleman Ganju Lama, crawling through mud with 3 bullet wounds, pulling grenade pins with his teeth because his hands were shattered. Think about Sergeant Wagger Thornton, who called the PIAT a load of rubbish and then used it to save Pegasus Bridge. Think about the Ordnance Board verdict: ineffective under any conceivable conditions of employment. In August 1941, that verdict seemed reasonable. The prototype was flawed. The spring was brutal. The range was laughable. Who would ever fight a tank from 50 yards away? By August 1944, thousands of British, Canadian, Indian, and Commonwealth soldiers had answered that question. They would fight tanks from 50 yards away because they had no other choice. And when they did, the weapon that should have been ineffective under any conceivable conditions proved devastatingly effective under the only conditions that mattered, the conditions of actual combat, where men did impossible things with imperfect tools because the alternative was death. That is the story of the PIAT, the ugliest weapon in the British arsenal, the most hated by its operators, the most vindicated by its results. 7% of German tanks destroyed in Normandy, 6 Victoria Crosses, 115,000 units produced. The Ordnance Board was wrong. The conditions were very conceivable indeed. They were the conditions of men like Robert Cain and Ganju Lama and Ernest Smith, men who would not stop fighting no matter what the experts said was possible. The PIAT was never designed to be loved. It was designed to kill tanks, and that, under every conceivable condition that mattered, is exactly what it did.